Our top story this morning: flooding across the U.S. Midwest. In states stretching from Texas to Ohio, rising water has been the worry. The floods are being blamed for at least 16 deaths, and dozens of roads have already been submerged. To another top international story we are following. Authorities in China today are describing scenes of serious violence in last week's Tibet protests. Hundreds of people wounded, many of them seriously, and almost 1,000 businesses set on fire. Authorities are also warning about the unrest spreading. Well, for a closer look at what's behind the Tibet issue, we are joined this morning by Tashi Rabgey. She's Director of Contemporary Tibetan Studies at the University of Virginia. Good morning, Professor Rabgey. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
I just want, for starters, we look at the Dalai Lama, who's been a central figure in the Tibetan movement. His position has always been a position of nonviolence. I just want to get your thoughts on what challenges he faces now at this point in the Tibet issue.
Well, the challenges are significant. I think we're in a very different situation now than we were before the protests erupted. The Dalai Lama has been painstakingly putting together a strategy to build confidence and trust. Of course, there's been the dialogue process that's been going on. And I think this really shatters a lot of the ground that was gained. And now I think the Tibetan constituency in exile also is going to be a lot more resistant to the strategy that he's laid out. So we're in a very different context.
Certainly. Is this a unified view, do you think, Professor, or are Tibetans even do they even differ on the approach that should be taken?
Well, I think that overwhelmingly Tibetans would say that they support the middle way approach, but I think there's a sort of strategic discontent and sort of an unhappiness about the fact that through 6 rounds of discussions that there's been nothing substantive that it seems that the Tibetans have gained. Having said that, I think that inside Tibet, what's interesting, a couple of things. One is that the vast majority of Tibetans are subsistence farmers, they're herders, nomads, and they're people of faith and devotion. And quite frankly, they would have faith in whatever path the Dalai Lama chooses. And the other interesting phenomenon that we've been tracking in the last few years is the emergence of a new Tibetan sector of society. Young Tibetans who've been educated entirely in the Chinese system in Chinese cities and who are articulating in an online forum their views on the situation, and there's a convergence with the Dalai Lama's vision and a real embracing of what he offers. So in fact, I think inside Tibet and inside the PRC there's an incredible consensus, extraordinary actually, lining up behind the Dalai Lama's vision. I think it's outside where we have more of the fault lines emerging.
Okay, and that was what I was going to ask you, because it's been extraordinarily aggressive, these protests that we have seen. So the question is, where does that come from?
Well, I think there's no question there's a deep-seated sense of dispossession, of collective loss, and certainly that's felt very deeply among the Tibetans in exile. I think that inside Tibet it's compounded by the reality of contemporary Tibet, the fact that, I think the leadership, the authorities in the Tibetan region have not figured out a way to effectively manage the region. They haven't provided the mechanisms for good governance. There have been the increasing repression over recent years. The massive resettlement of people, both nomads and farmers, the fact that the railway has brought in so many migrants that the face of Lhasa has changed, and Tibetans are also moving around quite a bit more than in the past. We have a lot of migrant Tibetans in urban areas who come from the rural countryside, and they feel that Tibet has already transformed, and I think that there hasn't been any mechanism of expressing any of these grievances, and so it's all sort of converged now in the way that it has.
And converging now at a time when just months from now, China, Beijing in particular, is going to come under this intense spotlight of the Olympics. I just want to get your thoughts, looking ahead to that, what we can expect and whether there are steps that can be taken for some peace in this volatility.
Absolutely. I tend to be an optimist, so I want there to be, you know, effective strategies out of this. One of the first things I think is to be able to understand the issue that's unfolding in its own lights. And I think that there's a lot being said to try to, you know, I think on the one hand, we tend to think, oh, well, these are just yet another set of Tibetan protests. And actually, these protests are very different than anything we've seen before in a generation. I think that that's important to understand because basically, first of all, the scale of the protest is different. We're seeing protests going on throughout the Tibetan inhabited areas, basically something that's coterminous with the plateau, the geographical feature of the you know, the land that's at about 14,000 feet, and that spreads, you know, that's across the Tibet Autonomous Region, but also into areas of what's now, you know, Gansu, Qinghai, Yunnan, and Sichuan. Yeah. And so we didn't see that in the 1980s. We're seeing that phenomenon, the scale of it. We're seeing a scope that's very different than before. It's not just the monks and nuns. It's not just, you know, the urban poor. It's, you know, it's teachers and students and people who belong to work units. We're really seeing a generalized sort of uprising, and this is very different. I think the most important point is that the policy failure that we've just seen represents something incredibly significant. That was put in place in order to address the last set of protests. So for they've had 20 years to deal with the 1980s protests, and this the policy framework that just collapsed in the last couple of weeks was put in place to address that. Now, if they're going to do just more of the same, you know, with the crackdowns and with the tightening of controls, even further tightening, although it's hard to imagine what else can be done, you know, I think it's already proven to be a failure. And I think what's needed more than anything else is that understanding from the Chinese leadership side.
Well, we await to see whether that gets put forward. Listen, Professor, appreciate your insight on this. Thank you so much.
All right.